Right, folks, we're going to be looking now, today, at one of the final topics in sustainable information and corporate governance. And we're looking at the concept of ethics, doing the right sort of thing. It's sort of kind of the bit behind governance, which is why are we doing these things? What happens if we don't do the right sort of thing? If we don't approach life, approach our governance from a way that thinks about, in a sense, good and bad, and principles of good and bad. But very briefly, let's go back to last week, business continuity. You did quite a bit of research last week on the principles of what business continuity is, what continuity planning is about, continuity management is about. And I'd like to just sort of wrap up those thoughts before we move into the role of ethics in governance. So just to sort of think about, as we deliver our services, as we deliver our new products, as we think about big data, as we think about analytics, with all, and particularly in the field of big data, with all that enormous volume of data that's out there and coming at us at an incredible rate of knots, what are the critical factors we need to think about to make sure we have the right sort of continuity management plans in place to support the organisation? Not just at an IT level, but also thinking about the broader corporate activity as well. And you looked last week at a whole range of problems caused by a failure of continuity planning. You should have found some examples of what actually went well when people got their plans correct and they did their practicing and so on. So what was the first sort of point that came out of your research last week, guys? Any thoughts at all? Were there any successes you found or any failures you found that were really valuable to actually have got it as your case studies?
I think there was one by Pepsi where they found syringes in their cans. That was in 1993, and the whole process was basically made public.
Yeah.
And so they sort of minimised the trust that way, instead of keeping everything hidden. They sort of exposed as much as they could.
So by exposing it, they could show that they were treating it seriously, and then solving the problem. So although going out public can cause a bit of a problem in the short term, in the longer term, because it will always get out there, in actual fact, being upfront. And if you go back last year, the year before, to things like the horse meat problem, again, coming out early, as soon as it's found and being seen to be doing something really active about it, helps to rebuild trust. If you look at the banking systems over the last, 6 years now since the crash in 2008, one of the problems is that banks don't yet seem to have really got round to how they can rebuild trust. Every time one of these new stories, whether it's Forex, foreign exchange trading, whether it's LIBOR or whatever, it's just yet another thing that is undermining and undermining. And they really aren't getting on top of the job at the moment. And so you can link that back into continuity planning. Is what do we do when the big issues come up and bite us? How do we get on top of the situation? How do we actually leave the situation rather than continually be on the back foot, trying to respond, trying to react? And if we look back over the last, 4 or 5 years of corporate governance failures, of problems when situations happen or get out into the press, get out to the public, undermining public trust, mostly we see reaction rather than we have a plan in place in case something like this happens and we can now start driving the agenda. leading the agenda to rebuild trust in our company. And it doesn't matter whether it's a big fire that wipes out your entire stock, as happened some years ago when Primark had a huge fire at their main distribution centre. They had got plans in place. They were able to text, email, phone, whatever, contact their suppliers overseas or wherever they are in the UK, and get, instead of having the lorries go to their distribution centre, they got them redirected straight to the shops. And actually were able to avoid any of their stores going out of stock. This was Christmas, I forget when, about 4 or 5 years, 6 years ago. And they were able to make sure that everything continued running. They had, in that fire, they also managed to lose quite a lot of their IT, and yet they were still able to carry on. They were able to keep the money flowing into the tills because they had the stock there. They had the till system all working, and they were able to then get everything going and keep it going, which was really quite an amazing success story. And yet others, they weren't able to succeed. They weren't able to keep the money flowing in, because money flowing in, cash flow, is probably one of the most critical things that you actually have to have running in your business. Because if you've got money coming in, you can pay your staff. If you've got money coming in and you've got your records, you can pay some of your suppliers and keep the most critical ones alive while you rebuild yourself. And so it means you've got to think about where your backups are, where your business continuity sites are, or disaster recovery sites are, as they used to be called. Banks typically will have 2 computer centres, well differentiated, one here, one there, maybe 50, maybe 100 miles apart. So that as soon as something goes down, if things are working properly, if your plan's there, then you just switch over to your alternative site. And of course, as we saw with that report from the Financial Conduct Authority last week into the RBS fine, their failure, as a result of failure of not doing the risk assessment properly in terms of the IT, not doing the business risk assessment properly, and not doing the audit compliance management side properly, they got their £56 million fine. Because they didn't actually get any aspect of business continuity right on that occasion. Now they say they spent several £100 million rebuilding their IT environment. Maybe we'll not see quite so many failures in the future. Let's hope. We don't know. So, moving on now to business ethics. Following the usual practice of some research, and then some questions, and then some analysis, I want you to find 3 or more good sources which are going to define this concept called business ethics. And kind of related to that in terms of research, you might want to start off with the very broadest perspective. What is the definition of ethics? And then narrow down the sort of cone of focus, the cone of research, to narrow it to what is ethics in relation to business? Is there a difference between the broader topic of ethics and the narrower concept of business ethics? So 3 or more sources that define ethics and business ethics. Then there's a little bit of an activity, and this is where you can discuss amongst yourselves in small groups, and then we may be able to discuss it across the wider group. What are we actually learning from these various different definitions? The definition of ethics, the definitions of business ethics. And one of the points here is to have multiple sets of definitions, multiple perspectives. Because if you go in and search for definitions, you'll find all sorts of different definitions from different perspectives. Some are broader, some are narrower, some are in one context, some are in a different context. And as you look at these different contexts, different perspectives, you should be able first to critically evaluate what each of these definitions is about, and then bring them together to synthesize them into your own perspective of what you want to use as a term for business ethics for the rest of your work. So once you've understood ethics and business ethics, which is at the sort of corporate level, the big broad topic area. I want you to start thinking about more research. Several articles. Now, it could be in the academic environment because there's a phenomenal amount of research into the field of business ethics, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of information governance. So I'd like you to think here about, rather than moving into staying in the sort of public, Google-y sort of stuff, I'd like you to go into the university e-journals, the academic journals, to find articles on business ethics in information and corporate governance, to find the impact. What does the research say about how business ethics actually improves the way that organizations operate their information systems, their information technology, and their corporate governance? And again, both in terms of success and failure. And on the second part, this bit, I'd like you to find both the academic research about the problems in business ethics, but I'd also think you will find some really quite interesting articles in the press, whether UK or the international press, about failures of business ethics. And there are some fairly spectacular ones over the last 5-10 years where business ethics has failed pretty catastrophically, where people have tried to shortcut their activities. Don't worry about the procedures or policies that actually are going to keep us safe, but let's try and save some money, try and save some time, try and save some resources, and things went wrong really, really big time. And some of the very largest companies in the world have had some of the most spectacular failures, and I'd like you to try and track some of those down to see what actually happened, whether it's to do with the financial services environment, whether it's to do with the oil and gas industries, whether it's to do with transport. There are cases all over the place that will be really quite valuable to understanding why we actually need to think about business ethics, why it will help us to have more successful and more sustainable organizations in the long term. And sustainable in terms of competition, in terms of a business model that just keeps going forward, rather than suddenly bring your company to a grinding halt very, very suddenly. So there's quite a lot of opportunities here to actually come up with some really interesting different perspectives on why ethics actually is so important and what happens when we get it wrong. So, in terms of the critical analysis, putting this whole lot together, the definitions that you got in the first little step, and then these case studies, both academic and the news, try and build up that critical analysis, that critical evaluation of the importance of business ethics in good governance and sustainable governance of organisations. And the hint here is, if we go back to some of those failures you found in your first couple of weeks of the semester, first of all, look at, were there any fundamental ethical issues that actually led to some of those big failures? And if you think about over the last year or so, Google, Amazon, Starbucks have had a range of different problems in the UK and in Europe, some of which are to do with a broader tax ethics position. Is ethics actually important in tax affairs, or is it just the rule of law, which is what they would argue? But if you think about Google and Amazon, they've also got other problems about things like data protection regimes and the other IT laws that are operational in the UK, but not in the same extent in the USA, where they're moat-based. Think also maybe of Facebook and their approach to retention of your data, or not, as the case may be, whichever way they're operating, and why they're having problems in Europe within the data protection regime. Is it an ethical question, or is it purely a matter of law? And is there a difference between ethics and law? Because these are sort of really, really important questions that actually become very significant as you go out into the big wide world as graduates of this university. Because understanding ethics and its relationship to governance, and the relationship of governance to the world of information technology, of big data analytics, and all the other things that are really topical at the moment, these questions are going to be really, really important. And then the final stage links us into the sustainability question, which is kind of at the back of the whole module. Corporate social responsibility. First of all, find articles on corporate social responsibility. Find out what it's about, definitions. Think about the role of ethics in corporate social responsibility programs, and then have a look at this last part, which is there anything, and this is going to be very, very much in the academic press, and there's a lot of research again being published around the world about, does having a good corporate social responsibility program, which some would argue is to do with ethics, business ethics, ethics within the community, does this actually have an impact on the long-term sustainability of organizations? If we go back to the Gulf problem of, what's about 6 years ago now, when to save 50 million, roughly, by cutting a few corners with that oil well, they had a huge explosion, killed some people, leaked unbelievable amounts of oil, crude oil, across the Gulf of Mexico, damaged an awful lot of people's livelihoods, and have now had to spend something in the region of $50 to $60 billion in recompense and so on. Now, what would have happened if they'd actually followed their policies and procedures? What are they doing now to try and rectify the situation amongst all of that community along the Gulf Coast? Is that corporate social responsibility really, or is it just, trying to fix things after the event because we got it so badly wrong, and we could have done much more earlier on? So, does good CSR, good ethics, good governance actually help companies to have a sustainable future? The activity. Okay, folks, time to get thinking about that. Before we finish that one, though, we'll just have a quick look at what the second half of the work is about. The workshop side. And what we're really doing with it here is drawing all of the threads together in the context of your assignment. So, you covered a whole lot of research in that first half, in this, what we might say, the seminar section. Now, and that's a lot of discussion, a lot of research, a lot of discussion amongst yourselves and with me, and so on. And then this part is very much applying it into your assignment. Which are the key issues that we covered today in your main research that might be of importance in your new strategy that you're developing? Does ethics, does corporate sustainable social responsibility have a role as part of that key strategy you're developing? Or is it just the background that sits there that facilitates the whole thing? In other words, is it one of the critical issues that you need to develop a strategic direction for, or is it just background? And then we could nicely, in a fortnight's time, after the final draft review next week, we could, just before we have one or two interesting sort of summary videos, which will be kind of interesting to pull the whole thing together in 2 weeks' time, it would be nice if we could have a little discussion on the ethics side question. Okay, folks, and that's it.